Let's face it, kimono do all have the same shape. Even male and female kimono, there is not a big difference. They basically look exactly the same. So how do you categorize different kimono? You probably have heard that kimono have different formalities. How do you know what kimono is formal and what kimono is casual? Well, the answer is actually easy. You have to look at two things. Number one, what fiber is the kimono made of? Is it made of silk? Is it made of cotton? That is going to tell you if the kimono is casual or formal. And number two, the motif. And I'm not talking about the image they are actually using. I'm talking about how the motif or the pattern on the kimono is produced, and that is going to tell you if the kimono is formal or casual too. The pattern placement is always a little bit important, but today we're not going to talk about pattern placement at all. We're going to scrap that, and we're just going to look at especially how the motifs are produced and also a little bit into the fiber. Let's go. In case you're new here, my name is Matsunaga and I'm a fully trained and certified kimono teacher and stylist. To know if a pattern is formal or casual, you first have to know the two big categories of how patterns are produced. You have one category that is called Atozome. Ato means after and someru means dyeing. So it is a pattern that is dyed after the fabric is woven, which means you have white fabric, can be anything, so cotton, whatever, and then you're gonna print or paint the pattern or the motif onto it. That is Atozome. The second category is called Sakizome. Saki means before, and zome again means dyeing. So it means the yarn is dyed before it's woven into fabric. It is basically a type of tie-dye. They usually tie up the yarn and then they leave some spots white and some spots colored. Like on the kimono I'm wearing today, this kimono is a Sakizome kimono, and you can see the pattern is produced by the blue and the white. This Sakizome is also called kasuri in Japanese. This is one of the words I really want you to remember, kasuri. Kasuri, by the way, in other cultures is called ikat. And indeed, this is a dyeing method that came probably from Southeast Asia to Japan. Kasuri and ikat are produced the exact same way. You have white yarn, and it's going to be tied up at the spots that are going to produce the pattern. They very often use some type of a cotton tape or like some nylon tape to actually tie it off. And this is then dyed. And later on they're gonna take off the tape and start to weave. But there are other intriguing ways to produce kasuri as well. For example, hokushi-ori, that is used when you produce mason. It's those beautiful antique kimono that were really booming in the 1920s and the 1930s in Japan. Hokushi-ori means in English unraveling weaving, and it is because first they weave the warp yarn into a temporary weave with a temporary weft yarn, and then they dye this temporary weave with a stencil. And when they weave it with the actual weft yarn, they are pulling out the temporary weft yarn while weaving it. So they're unraveling the weave while weaving, and that is why it's called hokushi-ori. These are very, very different ways of how to produce kasuri, woven pattern, or sakizome. And there are more types out there. There are different types of these temporary weaves, or sometimes instead of using a tape to tie-dye, they use boards to tie-dye. Despite only the ways of how kasuri can be produced, there will also be a difference in what yarn, and I'm talking about warp and weft yarn, is actually producing the pattern. What yarn is actually tie-dyed. Because there is, for example, tate kasuri. Tate kasuri means that the warp yarn is dyed and not the weft yarn. So when you look at the pattern closely, you can see that the pattern shifts a little bit up and down. And that is what we call tate kasuri. Then you have yoko kasuri. Yoko kasuri means that the weft yarn is dyed. And when you look at the pattern, you can see it very often shifts a little bit to left and right. And that's what we call yoko kasuri. And then you have something that's called tate yoko kasuri, which basically means both yarns are dyed, warp yarn and weft yarn. And when you put them together, it is going to create the pattern. So to sum that up, tate kasuri means warp yarn is tie-dyed, weft yarn is solid color. Yoko kasuri means weft yarn is dyed, warp yarn is solid color. And then tate yoko kasuri means warp and weft yarn are tie-dyed to produce the pattern. By the way, these little shifting, what I call a little bit shifting left and right, it's called kasuri ashi. But that's just a tiny side note to sprinkle all your new kimono knowledge. Overall, you can see that kasuri kimono are really work intensive, but if you have kasuri on your kimono, it's 100% a casual kimono. It cannot be a formal kimono. You should know that kasuri kimono nowadays, because most of the steps have to be done by hand, and if it's really traditionally made, like for example also using plant dye, those kimono can cost up to $8,000 or euros. And it's basically a jeans. And I know everyone is asking now, why is it so expensive and still a casual kimono? We have to look a little bit at the history of kimono for that. A dyed kimono was only for higher classes because it was so expensive to produce them. Because you first have to produce the yarn, you have to weave the yarn, and you finally have a finished fabric. And then they pre-stitch it together. It's a temporary kimono. And then they're gonna sketch on that kimono the pattern, so it becomes one big piece of artwork. They're gonna unstitch that, and then they have to put resist dye paste onto the pattern so they can dye first the background, and then they finally paint the pattern on it. There are way more steps in between, and then they finally have the finished fabric that can be stitched together. Oh, I forgot. Mostly it's also embellished with embroidery and gold. And when we, for example, talk about these hand-painted kimono in Kyoto that are called kyoyuzen, every step is done by a different artisan. So there is way more people involved, and it's gonna take so much longer to actually produce it. Why kasuri kimonos at that time was also produced by farmers. It was like a second income for them. And they were using easier fibers like cotton or hemp at that time, or damaged silk cocoons, because you couldn't really use them for the nice silk fabrics. And they would just make yarn out of that, easily tie-dye it, weave it, and that could be sold. Also, you have to keep in mind that today we have kasuri kimonos that have big pictures actually produced with kasuri. That is a technique that was known at that time, but it wasn't really done for kimono. Kimono were mostly produced stripe patterns or in check patterns, and those are also kasuri, but they're super easy to produce because it doesn't involve a lot of tie-dye. And that is why Sakizome is casual, and all the fibers that's involved in it is casual. It's produced by farmers, for the broad population. Atozome was even on Okinawa. It was for the upper class. Having that said, I personally think that these categories, what is formal, what is not formal, should be completely reinvented, because I think the craftsmanship that goes into a kimono should be more validated. Artisans, they spend sometimes months to produce a kasuri kimono, which also makes it so expensive. Atozome nowadays, the vast majority of yuzen kimono you see nowadays are printed by a textile printer. But still, in the kimono categories, in the formalities, a textile printer printed kimono is higher ranking than a kasuri kimono. In conclusion, the kimono formalities we have, they are based on kimono facts, on kimono history. If it was upper class, lower class, you know, it makes sense. It makes a lot of sense. That's why it's easy to teach. If you know all the background of it, it's really easy to understand. But when we look at the technology we have today for dyeing, I don't think that these rules are appropriate anymore. I think we need new rules today that really appreciate the hard work and craftsmanship that is put in some kimono, and we need to identify the kimono that don't have as much craftsmanship in them. Well, that's my last word on that. If you want to learn more about kimono theory, I have very long and intense sessions on my Patreon on kimono theory too. The formalities, how kimonos are dyed or produced. And because in April is my 5th anniversary of the Patreon community, I do have a 50% discount for new members. You might want to take a look. And for those of you who always wanted to take kimono dressing classes with me, this might be your chance too, because I have a 50% discount on your first class with me. Everything is linked down below. Check it out. And I hope you enjoyed this video. If you want to see more like this, tell me in the comments, and I'm gonna see you hopefully in my next kimono adventure. Why did I sigh there? Bye!